to you about the importance of using a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance when you're piecing together a quilt block. If you use a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance, you'll find that after you press that seam, now your seam allowance is a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. So to get around that, all you have to do is sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that means just a little bit more narrow. Then by the time you press it, it's a true 1/4 inch. So let me bring the camera in closer. I'll show you a few techniques to create that scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. The way I create my scant 1/4 inch seam allowance is on this machine. I use my 1/4 inch presser foot. I have my fabric lined right up along the edge as usual. And this machine has a cool feature where I can adjust the position of the needle. So I can just position it one click to the right, and that's about a thread's width. And that's all it takes to create my scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So check out the features on your sewing machine. Maybe you have that as well. Another thing you can do is with your 1/4 inch presser foot, go ahead and sew a seam as you normally would. And there's my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now place your fabric right back under your presser foot. And this time, let me pull my thread out of the way. Place your needle just a thread's width to the right of your stitch line. Put your presser foot down. Now simply use some painter's tape, being careful not to cover up your feed dogs. Place your tape right down next to your fabric. And now this tape will be your guide as you're piecing together your quilt blocks. And just as you're using your tape as a guide, just be as careful as you can to keep your fabric straight. Don't know if I'm doing a very good job here. And you can see that the thread is just to the right of your original 1/4 inch seam allowance. I did veer off a little bit here at the bottom, which you would really try not to do when you're actually piecing together your block. Another option is you can purchase a seam gauge and a seam guide. There's plenty of them on the market. This particular one is called Ideal Seam Gauge and Ideal Seam Guide. They're sold separately. And all you do is take your gauge, and on the gauge there's different seam allowances noted, and I'll be using the scant 1/4 inch. And you simply lower your needle into the hole for the scant 1/4 inch. Lower your presser foot. Now this still does have some movement, so you just want to make sure it's squared up the best that you can. At this point, if you don't have the seam guide, you can again use painter's tape and line it up with your gauge. And just like we did before, use the tape as your guide. So you would remove the gauge and line up your fabric right next to the tape. Now if you want to use the seam guide, I'll remove the tape, put the gauge back in, lower your needle into the scant 1/4 inch, I can see. Lower the presser foot, square up. This time using the guide. This particular one has a sticky backing, so you would remove this film, this plastic film. And all you do, it has a cutout here to avoid your presser foot and your feed dogs. So you carefully line it up with your seam gauge and just use your finger to apply a little pressure. You can see my sewing machine is rounded, So it's not a perfect device to use, but it still does work. Then you would remove your gauge. And use the guide, you leave it right in place. Use the guide to line up your fabric. And that creates the Scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you can see if you use your ruler to measure, you can see the 1/4 inch line on the ruler, and the stitch line is just to the right of that ruler line. And here's a quilt block that I made many moons ago, and I was not using a Scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'll just show you, it's supposed to measure 12.5 inches square. And when I measure it with my 12.5 inch square ruler, you can see how off it is along the side and along the bottom. It's almost 1/4 inch off. And that's because I used a regular 1/4 inch seam allowance on these crucial seams right here. If I would have used the Scant, it would have measured at least 12.5, maybe even a little larger, and I could have easily trimmed it to exactly 12.5 inches square. And I did want to mention that the more seams you have in your quilt block, the more important it is to use the Scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I also wanted to wish you a very happy new year. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.